Let's begin the conversation with the ongoing 78th United Nations General Assembly, where Nigeria's President Bola Ahmed Tinubu delivered a powerful inaugural address, emphasizing Africa's pursuit of prosperity through democratic ideas while rejecting foreign exploitation. He stressed Africa's desire to be self-reliant, free from old and new forms of oppression. President Tinubu also highlighted the need for global institutions and other nations to prioritize African development, recognizing it's significant for both the continent and the world. He also discussed the challenges posed by military coups, the battle against violent extremism in Africa, and the importance of addressing the flow of illicit arms into West Africa to ensure regional stability and economic growth. Now, joining me this evening on the conversation to discuss this is Sheriff Adekoya, who's a social commentator who joins us live from Lagos, and also Maliba, Arnold, policy analyst, joins us from Nairobi, Kenya. One welcome to you, gentlemen, and thanks for joining us on the conversation. But before I get straight into my first question to Sheriff, let's take a listen to an excerpt of President Tinubu's address at the United Nations General Assembly.
Let me emphasize Nigeria's objective accord with the guiding principles of this world body: peace, security, human rights, and development. In fundamental ways, nature has been kind to Africa, given abundant land, resources, and creative and industrious people. Yet, man has too often been unkind to a fellow man, and this sad tendency has brought sustained hardship to Africa's doorstep. To keep faith with the tenets of this world to this body, and the theme of this year's assembly, the poverty of nations must end. The pillage of one nation's resources by overreach of farms and people of stronger nations must end. The will of the people must be respected. This beautiful, generous, and forgiving planet must be protected. As for Africa, we seek to be neither appendage nor patron. We do not wish to replace old shackles with new ones.
I'd like to pick up from where Nigeria's President Bola Ahmed Tinubu left off in that expert. We don't wish to pick up new shackles to replace old ones. Now, Sheriff Adekoya, addressing foreign exploitation, and that was what President Tinubu was referring to, foreign exploitation. Addressing this is quite a complex task because no country is an island in that sense. How can African nations navigate the intricacies of today's global landscape to effectively overcome this challenge, as emphasized by President Bola Ahmed Tinubu? We had a situation in Niger where a kilo of uranium was selling for next to none, and the new junta just increased it to €8 per ton. How do we navigate this complex intricacies of when dealing in a globalized world to make sure we don't always, as African countries, get the short end of the stick?
Right, thank you so very much for having me. Well, thank you so much for having me, and good evening to you, and good evening. Yeah, good evening to you. Can you hear me?
Loud and clear. Go ahead, please.
Oh, great. So, talk won't do much of this magic, but it is critical that we look inward and we analyze the scenarios and the gesture. A while ago, I had the opportunity of discussing the first 100 days of President Bola Ahmed Tinubu in office, and I captioned what he has done so far, the stride he has put forward as a stride that showcases courage and capacity. So courage and capacity is not always about brick and mortar, but the mental will and readiness to do things right. So the biggest of our concerns in Africa has never been the shortage of resources. What we have always had has ever overly been the issues of overdose of narratives that are not brought to executional pedestals. So what we see in Niger has its own several outlets and inlets into local and international concerns. But for Africa, what we really need goes beyond policies and discussions and conversations, but the will to take the right policy from design to execution. Execution meaning we need to begin to experience sincerity of purpose. And nobody moves from a point to another point of higher pedestals without element of sacrifice and pain. So what I see in the last 100 days and more of President Bola Ahmed Tinubu has encapsulated in his speech yesterday showcases the fact that it seems we are truly ready to take the journey. We are truly ready to take the bold steps. You know, he attributed quite a number of things. He made mention of the word shackle. Shackle is in itself is a very sensitive word. We know, and these can actually have quite a number of denotative and connotative meanings. It is a word that you can attribute to the days of slavery, but slavery has gone beyond shackles. But using that in a context can actually be a grammatical use of issues holding down nations within the African hemisphere. And I feel
sorry to interrupt you, Sheriff. Just want to bring this in, and I'm glad you mentioned that you recently discussed the 100 days of President Bola Ahmed Tinubu in office. Now, at the global stage, President Tinubu is talking about, removing the shackles and having a new sort of Africa where we decide our future with fairness in global trade. But at the same time, and on the same end, in the first 100 days of his presidency, he is almost carrying out the IMF and the World Bank applauding him. And the IMF and the World Bank are known for its anti-people policies, for dollarization of the economy, the floating of the naira, and also the removal of fuel subsidies. So don't you see a contradiction here? You talk about a true independence of Africa, and at the same time, your policies almost seem to be dictated by the West.
Well, it's you really can't have any economy or driven by policy under democratic premise that is totally isolated or disconnected from the global village. We can't do things in isolation. So, instance, whatever policy you put up in Nigeria must not have reasons to contradict the existence of Ghana, because we share boundaries. Our geographical congruity has got fences, fence in between us. So that said, it is the same narrative, it is the same connect that we have from Nigeria across the global village. Let's take a throwback to 2019. We had a medical issue break out in Wuhan in China. And before you know it, in less than 12 months, the whole world was on its knees. That's the tale.
Okay, apologies for that. We seem to have lost connection with Sheriff Adekoya. I'd like to bring in Maliba Arnold in Nairobi, Kenya, into the conversation. Now, Maliba, Nigeria's President Bola Ahmed Tinubu, in his speech to the United Nations General Assembly, highlighted the theme of rebuilding trust and reigniting global solidarity for Africa. Looking back at 60 plus years post-independence, are there periods in our history as Africa that we really had this trust and a sort of global solidarity? Because if you look at the history of the post-Second World War world, it's been blocks against blocks. And if you come back to 2023 present day, it's, those that condemn Russia for the invasion of Ukraine, and there's also, it seems like another Cold War 2.0. Now, can you provide examples of how Africans can actively contribute to the achievement of the 2030 agenda and its sustainable development goals? And do we always need to look outwards for help, either it's east or west? How can we take our destiny into our own hands?
First of all, I think the AU General Assembly, not the AU, but the UN General Assembly for me, and I hate to actually say that I've attended quite a number of it. If you've been there as an African, you realize that it's a talking shop in its proper setting, because where the UN Security Council meets and everybody else, it's given a little bit of weight. In the days when I used to actually sit in as a youth delegate for Kenya through the UN DESA program, I realized that sometimes when your president is speaking at the UN General Assembly, as a country, sometimes you have to mobilize people to actually sit in the auditorium. If you took time and then looked at the auditorium, every time speakers come in, you realize that there is a fluctuation. And the auditorium is normally full when presidents and leaders from the West are actually talking. But then when African leaders are actually in, there are times where you will actually find a near empty hall if the country has not done a good mobilization and has not gotten a clearing for its people to actually sit in. But then speaking about trust and solidarity, how we actually go out there and seek trust and solidarity, then this is where I would like to begin. African leaders should should really talk the walk, because going to the UN to actually seek for solidarity for Africa, international solidarity, looking for justice to that particular end, when we are not doing it locally. You asked some practical examples on how we can get there. First of all, we cannot have African leaders going to the UN, going to the global platform to actually seek for solidarity, and they have not done that at home. Look at our regional blocs, for example. We are unable to actually come up with basic decisions sometimes that can actually bring order in our neighborhood. We can do tough talk, we can do serious talking, make threats, but we don't walk the talk. So when you're going to seek for solidarity at the UN, yet even at a regional level, let's say for EAC in East Africa, for SADC in the South, and of course in the West, those blocs, for example, there's not so much solidarity. And how do you build that solidarity? Trade together. Ghana and Nigeria are neighbors. How is the volume of trade between those two countries? Would you compare the trade of the volume of trade between Nigeria and Ghana with how Nigeria, for example, trades with Netherlands or Germany, which imports a little bit of quite a number of its refined oil, for example? So we are not even trading among ourselves. So solidarity will not come from outside. Solidarity will have to start down here. We are not doing that. Secondly, our leaders also need to believe in Africa and the African people, because it's easy to go to the international platform. And I've seen that, including my own president, actually going out there and speaking powerfully to where Africa should be and how the world should treat Africa. Let's first of all treat ourselves the way we want to be treated. Does Africa and its leaders treat the people and the continent at the same level it wants to be treated elsewhere? You cannot get respect on the global platform if you at home do not even get it right. So when you ask about the practical way forward and how we actually can get there, let's not look externally, let's look internally first of all. And we have got at national level, do we get it right? At regional level, and even at the AU. So before you talk about the UN, reforming the UN, have you looked at the AU? Is it an ideal? Is it an analog that you could actually point the UN to the reforms, for example? Because we as Africans have got control of the AU. So before we talk about reforming the UN, how well are we dealing with the AU? The AU is one of the most bureaucratic institutions. Making basic decisions, agreeing on simple paperwork at the AU is so difficult. Yet we want to actually speak to the world at the UN, tell them to change it now. Speaking about the institutions or rather, the second point for me would be talking about financial justice, how the international system, for example, treats Africa. What has stopped Africans, for example, from empowering the African Development Bank, for example? How does it work? Do we run to it? Will Africans go to the African Development Bank as a first option for any program rather than going outside? If you're going to do trade, is it easy for African countries and even Africans to approach the Afri-Exim Bank, for example? We are always looking outward, even where we have got monologues. So first of all, let us walk the talk. The leaders should do that. Secondly, ensure that we do to ourselves what we want the world to do to us. Put our money where our mouth is, and largely also move away from this victim call. It's been 60 years, like you've said. We fought for independence. A lot of us in Africa did fight for independence. How did we learn that? The people ahead of us, especially those that went to the Second World War, realized that it was a white man was not a god. That if you shot, they just cried, they wept, they died like any other person. And for people like us, for example, in East Africa, when our great-grandfathers came from the Second World War, they realized that we can organize and fight back. And that's exactly what they did. So I think 60 years of learning how the world order operates, it's important that we start to approach the world after we have swept our own backyard.
Okay.
Otherwise, every time we try to point a finger to the world, they point several fingers back to us about our backyard that is not really fixed.
I mean, Maliba, it's not as straightforward as you think, but it's a conversation we can have on another day, because a lot of African countries will argue that, you know, what we got was just flag independence, and that this interference of the West and the sort of deals they get is still, there's still a clear and present influence on the way Africans govern themselves, even with sit-tight leaders that have spent 30 plus years and 40 years with their families and government. But do we have Sheriff Adekoya with us? Okay. Now, Sheriff, I would like to pick up from where Maliba left off. You know, it was talking about post-colonial Africa and why we shouldn't always see ourselves as victims. Now, at the same United Nations General Assembly meeting, Nigeria's president drew a parallel between Africa's challenges and the post-war Marshall Plan in Europe. The Marshall Plan was headed by General George C. Marshall following the bombing and the Second World War of major European cities. It was a plan to help to rebuild its industries and also Germany from almost ground zero. Now, comparing modern day Africa's challenges to your post-war Marshall Plan in Europe, could you elaborate on the key distinctions President Tinubu emphasized and what sort of response is needed from the international community? Are we still begging for the West to save us? Are we looking for a savior? Because when you talk about a Marshall Plan, it sort of seems like that's what it is.
Well, thank you. I would want to say that Maliba made some valid points, and I like the response you gave that it is easier said than done. You really cannot abuse the crocodile for as long as you are still in the water. What we have is a pseudo-developed, largely pseudo-developed Africa. We see what is happening in DRC Congo. We've seen what is happening in the larger part of Nigeria. The biggest of our strengths lies critically around the natural resources that we have, the agricultural produce that we have. How do we translate and transform this to the numbers? We saw the narrative and the conversation between what is it called? The AFDB president Akinwumi, Dr. Akinwumi Adesina the other time, when he was emphasizing that we need to put in and plug in more of our financial and monetary capacity into transforming what we have in Africa. We will not be able to scale the Odu in as much as we remain the farmland, we remain the mine for the global growth. And you really cannot jump the gun. It happens and it has to follow the steps. It is critical. If you need to take Nigeria away from subsistence or semi-developed agricultural level, you need technology. Where are we on that scale of technological capacity, we still need to patronize them. So that's exactly why it is critically important that beyond the Marshall Plan, beyond some of these spoken and unspoken policies, we must find a way. And there's no way you will be able to do that if you fail to develop or to position and deliver that perception that arrogates respect to you. Nobody will want to trade with you if you do not have the gesture that attracts productivity. Why would I want to throw in my equipment to Nigeria if Nigeria is not promising? Are we promising on the both sides? Is the relationship we are putting on the table symbiotic? Is it one-sided parasite-host relationship or symbiotic? We should be looking at symbiotic relationship. That's exactly why I said this government has shown the capacity of a courageous lead. And that's exactly what you've seen in the last few days. It definitely will come with pains. Some of us feel our tanks with less than 20,000, around 14, 15,000. But right now, you spend way above 40,000. It's the pain we need to incur because we really cannot continue to spend and grow some people at the detriment of a lot of us, the collective growth. But that being said, there are ways to this. You really cannot begin on one Monday and by the end of the week, you are self-sustaining medically in the agricultural realm, technology realm, information realm. All of these are not possible. We need to look inward. We need to find a redirection for our education. You strangle your education today, what you get is a forfeited future. If you really want a future that is sustainable, then education must not suffer. We need to change away from certificate-driven economy to functional, productive economy.
And practical.
We should stop. Did you say something?
And practical. Yes.
Yes, we need to start getting practical because you really cannot, if you get 2 tons of cassava from 1 hectare of land using a subsistence or mixed approach, if you do it from the other side, you probably will get more. But how do you get there? We've not started manufacturing tractors, but we will not jump from today and start manufacturing tractors. We need to look inward, look at areas of comparative advantage. No country, no economy in the world can be self-sustaining. There's none. China would have its own strengths and will have areas of negotiation with US. US will have its own strength, will have a negotiation ground with Nigeria. One of the things I do not like, and I really hope that African leaders would say it, is that we need to unbundle Africa. We should stop talking and having negotiation with one European country and Africa. Imagine saying Turkish African Summit, meaning the whole of Africa. Over 50 countries in Africa.
I mean, those countries have specific needs. But Sherry, please permit me to move to Arnold because we're fast running out of time. Maliba, Arnold, just before we wrap up conversation this evening on the conversation, I would like to talk to you about the dismantling of extremist groups and curbing the flow of arms into West Africa, which is one of the key things that President Bola Ahmed Tinubu highlighted in his Onga speech. How can the international community step up its support for African nations, and what role should it play in this endeavor? And also, having the background that just recently there was a devastating flood in Derna in northern Libya, and former United States President Barack Obama did come out to say that people should mobilize and donate money to help Libya support its infrastructure and move on from this devastating disaster that happened. And quite a lot of commentators thought that was tone deaf. Barack Obama and his friends in NATO did destabilize this country. They forced their way through, and it seems nobody cares about the consequences, and no one is paying attention to that. So moving forward, knowing this as a background, and it was Dr. Henry Clark that said, Africa has no friends. How do we move on in our dealings with the West, and what solutions always come from the West? And should we always take dictates? Do they know best? And when do we begin to remove ourselves from this paternalistic relationship between the West and Africa?
First of all, it's important to just begin from this point that the relationship between Africa and the West has changed marginally from the days before independence and now. Initially, they came here for slaves, that is the human labor, and minerals. Today, there is brain drain. They love the beautiful brains from Africa. You will find them all over. It's still a prestigious thing to us. That is modern day slavery, where brilliant people would go out there in the name of globalization. You are going to find brilliant Nigerians in the US doing marvelous. Of course, we will celebrate that. But you see, it's not so far different from the slavery as it were. The West takes away that from nowadays, not by force. We go there willingly. Like in the days of old, they used to come here for minerals. They are still the people who created railways from minerals all the way to the ports. Look at Africa's railways today. They still look as they were in the days of old. Africa still gives the world a lot of minerals. I heard the other panelists initially say that Africa is so much of the farm to the world. It's not true. Africa cannot eat if the West or Asia and other countries have not farmed. We have got sufficient farmland, for example, to feed ourselves. And just a challenge, you would realize that before independence, we as Africans were able to feed ourselves without ships from elsewhere bringing in food. Today, Africa cannot feed itself if there's no rice from Asia, if there's no milk from Europe, and a lot of those other things. So that is then the third thing. That then I would actually call the only way that Africa has changed significantly in the way it relates to the West. Africa is now a market, and a very big market of about 1 billion people to the West. So they still come here for HR, for human resource, labor. That is, the days of old, they took it by force. Today, we go there willingly, or they outsource here and pay us poorly. So not so different. They still are taking away all minerals from our place here today. And then they still treat us as a market now. That is the third one that has changed significantly ever since we got independence. You asked about armed groups, for example. I've worked in Somalia for a while, and I would like the people in West Africa specifically to try and see how to combat violent extremism has actually worked, especially in East Africa. It's one of the longest frontiers, specifically in Somalia, where I have worked, and along the same line. That is guns, bullets, jets, and everything else cannot change that quickly. They don't to the people. You see that we do a lot, especially in public policy, that the term, I believe, is stronger than I know. So in places where we are trying to use boots, literally, let me just call them kinetics, the easiest way, you realize that you don't get so much out of that, other than going the softer way. If you are going to combat violent extremism through ideology, as opposed to deploying and employing kinetics, we think that kinetics can bring out results. They don't bring results so easily. So Africa should probably, the West, specifically in West Africa, we need to embrace what has actually worked in Somalia. Did you say something?
No, I'm just agreeing with your point, but we're fast run out of time now, and I say a big thank you to you, Maliba Arnold, public policy analyst, who joined us live from Kenya, and also Adekoya, social commentator, who joined us live from Lagos, Nigeria. It was a pleasure speaking to you both, and thank you for your time and your insights in the program. Thank you. You are to the conversation in News Central Television. We'll call a quick break, and when we return, we'll switch gears to Rwanda, where President Paul Kagame, who's been in power for 23 years, says is running for fourth term in 2024. We'll look at details of this and the implication for the political situation in Rwanda after this quick timeout. So stay with us.